My name is Madeline Carter, though everyone has always called me Maddie. I am 44 years old, and tonight was supposed to be the proudest moment of my career. For 26 years, I wore the uniform of the United States Air Force flying fighters commanding squadrons and finally rising to a level I had never dared dream of when I first signed my enlistment papers at 18. Tonight, inside the Pentagon itself, in a hall lined with flags and heavy with history, I was to be promoted to Major General. 2 silver stars on my shoulders, recognition that came after years of service sacrifice and relentless duty. My heart pounded as I straightened my dress blues and adjusted the collar. I was ready to honor the oath I swore long ago. But my family was not ready to honor me. They never had been. My stepfather, Richard Harper, had built a business empire in Richmond, Virginia. He measured worth only in titles and deals, only in the corporate world he controlled. My stepbrother Ethan grew up under that umbrella, spoiled, celebrated, never challenged. Richard never saw value in the path I chose. To him, the military was grunt work, a detour, something beneath the Harper name. My mother, Margaret, tried to soften his words, but silence is its own betrayal. For years, I endured Thanksgiving dinners where Richard boasted about Ethan's Navy career, painting him as a future admiral while dismissing me as a girl who played soldier. Ethan absorbed every ounce of that arrogance. He had risen through the ranks not by talent, but by connections, and tonight he walked into the Pentagon ballroom wearing his dress whites with the swagger of a man convinced the world owed him admiration. Guests gathered around him as he laughed and poured drinks, his voice carrying across the tables. I stayed quiet. I had learned long ago that my dignity lay in silence until the right moment. Still, my stomach knotted when I saw the cold glint in Ethan's eyes as he watched me approach the stage. He wanted to make this night his. The master of ceremonies spoke firmly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Madeline Carter promoted to Major General United States Air Force." Applause rose polite at first, then louder, filling the high ceiling of the hall. My chest tightened with pride, my throat aching as I thought of the years, the missions, the faces of airmen I had led. I took a step toward the podium, my shoes striking the polished floor, every sound magnified. Then, in one violent heartbeat, everything changed. Ethan stood. His chair screeched across the floor. He lifted a heavy crystal glass, the kind set at every place on the white linen tables. Before anyone understood, he hurled it with all his strength. It was not a clumsy slip or drunken accident. It was deliberate, fueled by years of resentment and cruelty. The glass flew through the air and struck my temple with a sickening crack. Pain shot white-hot through my head. I staggered, one hand rising instinctively to catch myself. Warm blood trickled down my face, staining the edge of my collar. The room fell silent, a collective gasp ripping the applause to shreds. Hundreds of eyes locked on me. For a fraction of a second, the only sound was the ringing in my ears and the faint drip of wine and blood on the marble floor. Security surged forward, but it was too late to prevent the blow. They grabbed Ethan by the arms, but his smirk lingered. He had done it in full view, seeking approval. And in that frozen moment, I caught sight of Richard. My stepfather did not rise. He did not rush to stop his son. He only lifted his chin, slightly eyes narrowing, and gave a subtle nod as though to say, "Yes, this is discipline. This is the order of our house." Betrayal cut deeper than the glass. My vision blurred, but I stood tall. I would not collapse before them. Blood trickled across my cheek, stinging my eye, but I fixed my gaze straight ahead. My body screamed for me to sit, to retreat, yet my spirit clenched harder than ever. I had carried aircraft through turbulence more violent than this. I had led men and women into combat zones with stakes far greater than the disdain of a broken family. But this was my ceremony, my reckoning, and I would not be reduced to shame. Then the twist came. The very man Ethan hoped to impress his commanding officer, Captain William Hargrove, pushed back his chair with such force it rattled against the wall. His face burned crimson fury etched into every line. He shouted across the silent hall, voice booming with authority that silenced even the generals. "Ethan Harper, sit down. The words cracked through the air like thunder. Every guest turned toward him. Ethan froze disbelief splashing across his arrogant grin, but Hargrove was not finished. He pivoted sharply, eyes locking on me, and in that instant the room seemed to tilt. He straightened his back, heels snapping together, and raised his hand in a perfect salute. "Major General Carter." His voice carried steady, unyielding, filled with respect Ethan could never fake. The hall erupted. Applause thundered echoing off the marble walls. Generals rose, senators rose, even civilians rose, all following Hargrove's lead. My bloodied temple throbbed, but my heart surged. For the first time in 44 years, before the very family that had mocked me, I was seen for what I truly was. Not a little soldier girl, not a disappointment, but Major General Madeline Carter. And this was only the beginning. Has your family ever tried to crush your worth? Hit subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. The applause that roared through the Pentagon Hall after Captain Hargrove's salute still echoed in my ears, but as I stood bleeding under those lights, another sound rose from my memory. It was the cold laughter of Richard Harper, the man who had raised me in a house where control passed for love, and where my worth had been measured in how well I obeyed his map for my life. To understand why that glass had flown at my head, why Ethan's cruelty felt like destiny fulfilled, you have to see where I came from. Richmond, Virginia was our home, a brick colonial house that looked perfect on the outside with white columns and manicured lawns. Inside it was a battlefield. Richard had married my mother when I was 8. My real father had died of a heart attack, a man who believed in service and had worn the uniform himself. He left me a folded flag and stories of honor. Richard left me rules charts and disdain. He was a construction magnate building towers and highways, and he ran our family with the same cold authority he used in boardrooms. At dinner, he sat at the head of a long oak table, his voice cutting through every conversation, every laugh, every protest. He mapped our lives like he mapped blueprints. My older stepbrother Ethan was to be a Navy officer destined for power, and Richard funded his way into the best prep schools and academies. My mother, Margaret Gentle and Fearful, sat at the far end trying to smooth every conflict with soft words and nervous smiles. She rarely succeeded. And me, Maddie, the daughter from another man, the constant reminder that Richard had not built everything from scratch. From the start, I was out of place. He called me our little soldier girl even before I had any idea of joining the military. The nickname dripped with sarcasm. If I showed interest in history, he sneered that I was chasing fairy tales. If I played outside, he mocked me for pretending at war. At 13, when I mentioned wanting to visit the Air Force Museum in Hampton, he barked that only lost souls looked for meaning in uniforms. Ethan laughed on cue, learning early that mocking me won approval. Our dinners became rituals of humiliation. Richard would pour bourbon lean back and begin the parade of praise for Ethan. "Son, you'll be a leader one day. The Navy needs men like you." Then his eyes would slide to me. "And you, Maddie's still playing dress-up." My mother would whisper, "Richard, please," but her voice was a paper shield against steel. Silence from her cut worse than Richard's words. That silence taught Ethan that he could push me, shove me, and laugh without consequence. I learned to retreat into books, into running down back roads of Richmond just to feel air in my lungs. But even the air felt heavy when I knew I had to return home. By the time I was 17, the plan was laid out. Richard wanted me in the Harper firm. He had arranged a summer internship in Norfolk, talking of corner offices, mergers, corporate ladders. I felt trapped as if my life had been paved before me in concrete. I remember standing in my room, staring at the brochure for Langley Air Force Base's recruitment program. It shimmered like a door out of prison. When I told Richard that I wanted to enlist, his face turned a shade of red, darker than a Virginia sunset. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted that I was throwing away a golden ticket for grunt work. Ethan leaned back, smirking, saying, "Guess she really does want to play soldier." My mother wept, not out of pride, but fear, whispering, "Please, Maddie, just take the internship. Do not upset him." But I had tasted enough of Richard's map to know I would suffocate under it. I told him I would not be bought. His eyes went cold. That night, he locked me out of the study and for weeks treated me as invisible but never free. At every holiday gathering, he reminded me of my choice. Our little pilot, he would say, and the cousins would chuckle nervously. Ethan learned to weaponize the nickname, calling me Fly Girl, while he boasted about his Navy training. I swallowed the insults, carrying them like hidden stones. And each stone made me stronger, though I did not realize it yet. The truth is, toxic families do not erupt in one day. They grind you down year by year until the idea that you are worthless seeps into your bones. I carried that weight into the Air Force, telling myself I had to earn every ounce of respect on my own. Richard never visited me at Langley. He never wrote during my deployments. Ethan sent one letter once, not to encourage, but to gloat about his commissioning ceremony. Still, every time I touched the controls of an F-16 and felt the jet lift into the sky, I knew I had chosen my life, not Richard's. And yet the scars of those Richmond dinners stayed. When you grow up hearing that your worth is a joke, you chase silence instead of recognition. I kept my promotions quiet, never bragged at family gatherings, never corrected Ethan when he claimed to outrank me. Part of me hoped that someday Richard might look at me without needing the shine of stars on my shoulders, but another part of me was too weary, too bitter to try. Looking back, it makes sense that Ethan hurled that glass. He had grown up knowing every act of cruelty earned Richard's nod. The night in the Pentagon was not the beginning of that violence. It was the climax of decades of it. To the crowd, it looked shocking. To me, it looked inevitable. The summer I turned 18, Richmond felt smaller than ever. The streets I used to run on as a girl seemed to close in like corridors funneling me toward a future I had not chosen. Richard had already arranged my internship at Harper Construction in Norfolk. He spoke of it with certainty, as if I were a contract already signed. Every morning he left newspapers folded open to the business section at my place on the table, pointing at articles about mergers and corporate expansions, saying, "This is where real power lies." My mother nodded silently, her eyes darting to me as if pleading for compliance, and Ethan smirked like the throne was already his. But I could not breathe in that house anymore. The walls carried every sneer every time Richard called me our little pilot. The weight of their certainty suffocated me. I wanted to carve my own path, even if it meant stepping into fire. One Saturday, I took the bus alone to Langley Air Force Base in Hampton. The air smelled of salt from the Chesapeake Bay, and the sound of jets cracked overhead thunder rolling across the sky. I felt something stir in me that I had never felt in Richard's world of concrete and contracts. I walked into the recruitment office, my hands trembling, and asked for information. The recruiter, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, slid me a form. She told me the Air Force was not a game, not an escape, but a commitment that would demand everything. I told her that was exactly what I wanted, to give everything to something that mattered. For the first time, someone looked at me not as a burden, but as a potential leader. I left that office with papers in my bag and fire in my chest. When I brought them home, Richard exploded. He paced the kitchen, slamming his bourbon glass on the counter, shouting that I was throwing away a golden ticket. He said the Air Force was for people with no options, no future. I was wasting my life. Ethan leaned in the doorway, grinning, tossing a baseball in his hand as if this was a show staged for his amusement. He said maybe she can fly crop dusters when she's done. My mother cried, clutching the edge of the table, begging me to reconsider. Her fear was real, but her words chained me. I looked at Richard and said, "I am not your employee." I looked at Ethan and said, "I am not your shadow." And I looked at my mother and said, "I cannot live a life built on fear." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Richard's jaw clenched. He told me if I left, I was no longer his concern. He said the Harper name would not be attached to failure. That night, I packed a duffel bag and left the house. I stood on the curb in Richmond with the warm air pressing against my skin, wondering if I had just cut myself off from everything I had known. But as the bus pulled away toward Hampton, I felt a surge of freedom I had never tasted. The following weeks were a blur of forms, medical checks, and swearing the oath. When I raised my right hand and promised to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, I felt the weight of my father's folded flag in my heart. It was the first moment in years when I felt connected to him, the man Richard could never replace. Basic training stripped me down and built me up again. The first time I pushed through a 40-pound ruck march in the Virginia heat, sweat blinding my eyes, I heard Richard's voice mocking me, calling me weak. But each step was defiance. Each mile was proof. I was not weak. I was not his to control. The first time I sat in the cockpit of an F-16 trainer, the roar of the engine beneath me, I felt power that no corner office could ever rival. In that cockpit, I was not Richard's disappointment or Ethan's punchline. I was Maddie Carter, pilot, airman, future leader. I sent one postcard home from Langley. I wrote to my mother, not to Richard or Ethan. I told her I was safe, that training was hard, that I believed in what I was doing. She never replied. Months later at Thanksgiving, I returned home in uniform. Richard barely looked at me, only grunted that I was still playing soldier. Ethan laughed and asked if I had learned how to pour coffee for real officers yet. My mother hugged me but whispered, "Please keep peace." I smiled, but inside I vowed never to let their scorn define me. Each insult became fuel. Each laugh became a reason to climb higher. I had chosen my path, and I would walk it no matter how much blood it drew from me. That decision, that single bus ride to Langley, was the line in the sand. On one side was the cage of Harper expectations. On the other was the sky, vast and merciless, but mine. I chose the sky. The first years in uniform carved me into someone Richard and Ethan would never recognize. At Langley, I learned to fight through exhaustion, to push past limits I never knew I had. The early mornings began before sunrise, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and sweat. I marched, ran, saluted, studied, and fell into bed each night with bruises on my shoulders and pride in my chest. When I earned my wings and strapped into the cockpit of an F-16 for the first time, my world split open. The roar of the engine shook through my bones, and the horizon stretched wide and merciless. I knew this was where I belonged, yet every call home brought the same sting. My mother's voice, soft, worried, asking if I was eating, if I was safe. Richard's voice never once on the line. Ethan occasionally shouted in the background, mocking, asking if I had learned to fetch coffee for real pilots. I stopped expecting respect from them. I focused on respect from my crew, from the airmen who trusted me in the skies. My deployments began soon after. Iraq first, long, dusty days and nights when the sound of gunfire carried over the desert winds. Flying missions taught me to balance fear and focus. I saw comrades fall, and I saw civilians look up at our jets with eyes full of desperate hope. It burned into me that the uniform was more than fabric. It was promise. It was service. I came home from that deployment leaner, harder, more certain. When I walked into the Harper house in Richmond for Christmas, Richard barely looked up from his bourbon. Ethan greeted me with a smirk, already wearing his own navy whites. He said, "Real warriors sail the seas, Maddie not fly toys in the sky." Richard chuckled as if Ethan had spoken truth. My mother tried to cut in, saying Maddie just came back from war, but Richard dismissed her. He said a pilot is just a bus driver with wings. The words sliced through me, but I refused to show it. I excused myself, went upstairs, and stared at the folded flag my real father had left me. I whispered to it that I would carry on no matter how invisible I was under Richard's roof. Over the next decade, my career accelerated. F-16s gave way to F-35s. I moved from pilot to squadron leader, from squadron leader to wing commander. Each step demanded more of me: long nights of strategy sessions, endless hours in simulators, responsibility that pressed down like gravity. But with responsibility came respect. General officers began to notice my work, my ability to see not just the battle, but the bigger picture. I was invited to briefings at the Pentagon, my voice carrying across rooms filled with men twice my age and rank. And still, when I returned to Richmond, Richard introduced me as our little pilot. Ethan, meanwhile, climbed too, but slower. His arrogance cost him chances. His drinking grew heavier. Yet Richard praised him as if he were the second coming of naval greatness. Every insult, every slight fueled me more. The sting turned to steel. I told myself one day the truth would crash down on them. One day I would not need to speak. My stars would speak for me. By the time I turned 35, my uniform bore decorations that Richard never bothered to ask about. I had led missions across the Middle East, flown sorties in tense skies where one wrong move meant disaster, and guided younger pilots through storms of fear and fire. I had earned a master's degree in global strategy at the National Defense University, spending nights poring over maps and scenarios while the city of Washington, D.C. pulsed outside. My reputation grew. Senior leaders began to call me not just a pilot, but a strategist. They saw in me what Richard refused to see, a mind able to shape battles beyond the cockpit. The promotion to colonel came with little fanfare at home. I returned for Easter that year, walking into the Richmond house in full dress uniform, hoping for once that the sight might pierce Richard's armor of disdain. He looked up, squinted, and said, "Still chasing clouds, I see." Ethan, already nursing a drink, laughed and muttered that someday maybe I would make real rank. My mother reached for my hand under the table, her silent way of saying she was proud, but silence could not drown out mockery. I ate in quiet, my chest tight, each forkful tasting like ash. Yet I carried their dismissal back to base and turned it into fuel. Every exercise, every strategy session, I poured more of myself into proving that leadership was not given. It was earned in sweat discipline and vision. 3 years later, I was tapped for Brigadier General. At 41, I pinned on that single star and felt a rush of vindication that I could not share with the people who should have cared most. Richard did not attend the ceremony. Ethan sent no message. My mother mailed a card simple with congratulations written in her careful script, but I could feel her fear woven between the lines, fear of Richard's reaction if she spoke too loudly of my success. Still, that star on my shoulder was more than metal. It was proof that the girl mocked as Fly Girl had outflown the shadow cast over her, but even victory carried bitterness. The next Thanksgiving, Ethan arrived in Richmond wearing his captain's bars, parading around the living room as if he had conquered oceans. Richard beamed at him, clapped his shoulder, and told the family that Ethan was the pride of the Harpers. Then his eyes slid to me, and he added, "Our little pilot is still buzzing around somewhere." The guests chuckled nervously. I sat still, every muscle tight, and forced a smile. Inside, fire roared. I had briefed the Secretary of Defense weeks before, outlining a Pacific readiness plan that would later save the Pentagon $500 million. I had stood in rooms with the nation's top generals, and here in my stepfather's house, I was still a punchline. That night, as I drove back to base, the lights of Richmond fading in my mirror, I whispered to myself that one day they would see. One day their words would collapse under the weight of truth. And when that day came, it would not be whispered or hidden. It would be public, undeniable shattering. The climb from Brigadier General to Major General was the steepest. The pressure was relentless, the scrutiny fierce. I commanded thousands, made decisions that rippled across continents. Sleep became a luxury, but purpose burned brighter than fatigue. When the call came that I would be promoted at 44, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the stars on my desk. I thought of my father's flag. I thought of every insult Richard had thrown, every smirk Ethan had worn. And I thought of my mother trapped in a house of silence. This promotion was not only for me. It was for every moment I had been dismissed. It was for the girl who once believed she was invisible. It was for the night in Richmond when Richard had told me no daughter of mine will waste her life in uniform. He had been wrong, and soon in the heart of the Pentagon before the nation's leaders, he would have to face it. I was 25 the night I understood that my family would never simply let me exist. It was not enough for Richard and Ethan to dismiss me, to mock me at dinners, to laugh at my uniform. They had to break me in front of others. They had to make a spectacle. The occasion was my cousin's wedding in Richmond, a grand event held in a ballroom filled with chandeliers, champagne towers, and the endless chatter of Southern society families. I had just returned from a deployment overseas, still carrying desert sand in my boots, still hearing the echo of jets in my dreams. I wore my Air Force blues that night because I was proud, because I believed maybe in that setting surrounded by extended family, someone might see me for who I was. My mother squeezed my hand when we walked in, whispering, "You look beautiful, Maddie." but her eyes flickered nervously toward Richard as if she feared even those small words would spark his wrath. Ethan was already there, drink in hand, surrounded by cousins. His voice carried across the room, loud and mocking. "Look who showed up, our little soldier girl still playing dress up." Laughter followed brittle and sharp. I kept my chin high, telling myself I had survived worse than words. I had flown missions where tracers lit the night sky. I had stared at radar screens praying for safe returns. I would not crumble in front of shallow laughter, but Richard would not let it rest. Later that evening, as the music swelled and guests drifted to the dance floor, he cornered me near the banquet table. His bourbon breath hit me before his words did. "What are you doing here in that uniform?" he sneered, as if the blues themselves were an insult to his empire. "You embarrass this family parading around like a child in costume." My chest tightened, my hand curling into a fist at my side. I told him calmly that I was serving my country, that I had just returned from deployment, that this uniform was not a costume, but a commitment. His face twisted red, creeping up his neck. He shouted loud enough for half the room to hear. "Serving your country is just an excuse for failing at real life. You will never be anything more than a girl pretending to be a man." Conversations around us hushed. Eyes turned. And then it happened. His hand whipped across my face with a crack that silenced the room. The sting burned, and for a second the world tilted. Gasps echoed. A cousin dropped her glass. I steadied myself, but before I could breathe, Ethan stepped forward. He laughed a cruel bark and shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a chair, then the floor. My palms scraped my knees bruised, but the sharper pain was the sound of laughter muffled behind hands and the sight of family turning away. They pretended not to see. They looked at their shoes, at their drinks, anywhere but at me, sprawled on the carpet. My mother rushed forward, but Richard barked, "Margaret, sit down," and she froze, torn between me and his command. She sank back into her chair, tears streaking her cheeks, but she did not move. Ethan loomed over me, smirking, saying, "Maybe next time wear a real suit instead of that toy." Richard pulled him back with a satisfied nod, as if proud of his son for finishing what he started. I pushed myself up, face burning, uniform rumpled blood on my lip. My pride screamed at me not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction. I stood tall, my voice shaking but clear. "One day you will regret this. One day you will see what this uniform means." Richard scoffed, turning back to the bar. Ethan laughed again, clinking glasses with a cousin. And just like that, the room resumed. Music swelled again, people danced as though nothing had happened. I stood there in a bubble of humiliation, my heart pounding like a drum, every nerve alight with fury. That night I drove back to base alone. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Tears blurred the highway lights, but beneath the tears was fire. I whispered to myself over and over, "They will face the truth. They think they have crushed me, but I will rise higher than they can imagine." I swore that vow with every mile between Richmond and Langley. I swore it when I looked in the mirror at the bruises the next morning. I swore it every time I pinned my uniform, every time I saluted, every time I studied late into the night. That moment at 25 became my fuel. The sting of his slap, the shove that sent me crashing, the silence of family who looked away, all of it forged steel in me. I knew then that my life would not be about their approval. It would be about proving that no amount of cruelty could stop me. The truth was, they had given me a gift wrapped in pain. They had shown me that I could not wait for their validation. I would build my worth in the sky in strategy rooms in the respect of those who understood sacrifice. And one day in a hall they could not ignore in front of witnesses who mattered. I would stand not as the girl they mocked, but as Major General Madeline Carter. That vow carried me for nearly 2 decades. It carried me through the endless nights, through the losses of comrades, through the fatigue of command. It carried me until the night in the Pentagon when Ethan's glass came hurtling again and history tried to repeat itself. But this time, the world would not look away. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, the Pentagon seal pressed into the heavy paper. I held it in my hands with a tremor I could not hide, though I had already been told by my superiors that the promotion was coming. Words on a page do not carry the weight until you see them written in ink. Effective immediately, Brigadier General Madeline Carter is promoted to Major General United States Air Force. A date, a time, a hall inside the Pentagon itself. My chest swelled with pride and a strange ache. This was what I had chased through decades of sweat and sacrifice, through humiliation and silence. Yet the first thought that crept into my mind was not celebration, but dread. Family invitations would be sent. Richard, Ethan, my mother, they would be there. The Air Force believed in honoring family at milestones. To them, it was recognition of the sacrifices made at home. To me, it was a loaded weapon pointed straight at my heart. I stared at the invitation that bore my name, imagining Richard's smirk, Ethan's swagger, my mother's quiet tears. I considered leaving them off the list, but tradition was tradition, and part of me wanted them to see to witness what they had dismissed for so long. The ceremony was weeks away, but the weight of it pressed on me daily. Training sessions, briefings, preparations, all of it was shadowed by the knowledge that they would be in the audience. I called my mother one evening. Her voice trembled when I told her about the promotion. She whispered congratulations, but behind her words I heard fear, the fear of Richard's temper. "Does he know yet?" I asked. A pause, then, "Yes. He said he will attend." My stomach tightened. I asked about Ethan. She hesitated again before answering. "He said he would not miss it for the world." The sarcasm in his tone carried even through her voice. That night I barely slept, replaying images of the wedding years earlier, the slap, the shove, the silence. I told myself this would be different. This was my day, my recognition. Yet a whisper in my mind warned that the Harpers never came to honor me, only to diminish. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into preparation. Uniform inspections, speech drafts, meetings with senior officers, all the mechanics of ceremony. Outwardly, I stood calm, the image of discipline. Inwardly, I wrestled with ghosts. At briefings, I would catch myself drifting, imagining Ethan's laugh echoing in the Pentagon halls, Richard's dismissive eyes sliding past me. My colleagues sensed the weight on me, though they never asked directly. They congratulated me, clapped my back, told me I had earned every inch. I nodded, smiled, thanked them, and kept the storm inside. The weekend before the ceremony, I drove down to Richmond. I told myself it was to see my mother, to give her comfort before the trip to Washington, but part of me wanted to measure the battlefield before stepping onto it. Richard greeted me at the door with his usual bourbon in hand. He looked me up and down, smirk tugging at his lips. "So they are giving you another toy star." Ethan appeared behind him, taller now, thicker around the middle, his uniform crisp, but his eyes glassy with drink. He clapped slowly, mock applause, saying, "Well done, Fly Girl. Maybe one day you will catch up to real officers." I bit my tongue. My mother hugged me fiercely when Richard turned away, her eyes wet. I whispered to her that this was not their stage, it was mine. She nodded, but her hands shook. At dinner, Richard held court as always, bragging about Ethan's Navy career, talking loudly about contracts, dismissing the military as a sideshow. When conversation drifted to my promotion, Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Do not embarrass us, Maddie. Do not think your little pilot game makes you more than you are." The table laughed nervously. I stared at him unflinching and answered only with silence. Silence that he mistook for weakness, but that I knew was coiled strength. Driving back to Washington that night, the Richmond skyline fading in my mirror, I felt the vow burn again. This ceremony would not be like the wedding. No one would look away this time. No slap, no shove, no glass thrown could erase what was carved in my record and my stars. They would face the truth whether they wanted it or not. The morning of the ceremony, I laid out my dress blues on the bed, every crease sharp, every ribbon aligned. I ran my hand over the fabric, thinking of the years it represented. Sweat, blood, silence, and steel. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "Today you stand, Maddie, and the world will not look away." The Pentagon has a sound of its own. It is not the chatter of tourists or the shuffle of workers. It is the hum of history, the echo of decisions that shaped the world. On the morning of my promotion, that hum seemed louder than ever as I walked through the marble halls, my dress blues sharp, my heart pounding like a drum. Flags lined the corridor, each one a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices laid down. My steps were steady, but inside a storm churned. This was my moment, the culmination of years of silence and grit. Yet my thoughts circled back to the guests seated in the hall. Richard and Ethan had arrived early. I had caught a glimpse of them as I entered. Richard in his tailored suit bourbon already staining his breath. Ethan in his navy white's smirk plastered across his face as if the ceremony were staged for his amusement. My mother sat between them, shoulders hunched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than ever, a woman squeezed between loyalty and fear. The hall filled quickly, generals in full uniform, senators in tailored suits, staffers with notepads, family members whispering proudly. The stage gleamed under chandeliers, the podium standing tall, the seats arranged with precision. I took my place at the side, waiting for my name to be called. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, his voice carrying strong and confident. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor one of our own, a leader whose service has shaped our force. Brigadier General Madeline Carter, promoted to Major General, United States Air Force. Applause thundered through the hall. I stepped forward, my chin lifted, my shoulders square. The sound rolled over me, but beneath it I felt the burn of Richard's stare, the curl of Ethan's grin. My eyes swept the crowd, searching for steadiness. I found it in Captain William Hargrove, seated a few rows back, a man Ethan idolized, a commanding officer known for discipline. His gaze met mine, steady and respectful, a reminder that rank is not given by family, but by service. I reached the podium, my breath measured, my heart hammering. The MC continued listing my accomplishments, the commands I had led, the strategies I had written, the missions I had flown. Pride swelled in my chest, but just as it crested, the moment cracked. A chair scraped violently against the floor. I looked up to see Ethan standing, his jaw tight, his eyes glinting with something darker than arrogance. He held a crystal glass in his hand, the kind filled moments before, with water and ice. In an instant, he hurled it. The world slowed, the glass cutting through air, spinning, catching the light. Gasps erupted too late. The glass struck my temple with a sickening thud, shattering, spraying shards across the stage. Pain burst hot and blinding. My knees wobbled, but I forced myself to stand. Warm blood slid down my cheek, dripping onto the polished floor. The hall froze. Hundreds of eyes fixed on me, mouths open, hands covering faces. For a breathless second, the Pentagon itself seemed to stop. Security lunged forward, but they had moved a second too late. Ethan stood tall, chest heaving as if he had proven something. My hand rose to my temple, blood smearing my fingers. I steadied myself, refusing to fall. My vision blurred, but my resolve hardened. I would not collapse. Not here. Not now. Across the hall, I saw Richard. His face was unreadable, but his chin lifted in the faintest nod. The same nod he had given years earlier when Ethan shoved me at the wedding. Approval disguised as discipline. My heart clenched. It was not just Ethan's glass that had struck me. It was decades of Richard's silence and Margaret's fear. Gasps rippled again as I straightened, shoulders square, head high despite the sting of blood. The crowd murmured, whispers rising like waves. My ears rang, but above the noise I heard Ethan's voice, sharp and cutting. Still a little soldier girl. My blood boiled. My fists clenched. But before I could speak, another voice cracked through the silence like thunder. Captain William Hargrove's voice ripped through the hall with the force of a cannon. Ethan Harper, sit down. His words did not wobble, did not plead. They struck the air sharp, commanding, undeniable. Every head turned toward him. Ethan froze, glassy eyes wide, his arrogance faltering under the weight of authority he could not mimic. But Hargrove was not finished. He rose to his full height, shoulders squared, his uniform immaculate, his expression carved from steel. He pivoted, and for a heartbeat the entire hall held its breath. His eyes locked on me, blood trailing down my cheek, uniform stained, but posture unbroken. He snapped his heels together and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Major General Carter. The title thundered clear and deliberate, a declaration for every ear in that room. The silence shattered. Applause roared like a tidal wave. Generals rose first chairs, scraping back their palms, striking together. Then senators, staffers, civilians, one after another, until the entire hall surged to its feet. The sound echoed against the marble, rolling through the Pentagon like a storm. My chest tightened, tears threatening, but I held my salute steady, my body locked in discipline. For decades, I had stood invisible under Richard's roof, dismissed at his table, mocked by Ethan's laugh. And here, before the nation's leaders, I was undeniable. Ethan's smirk dissolved his jaw, slack eyes darting between me and Hargrove. He stumbled as security gripped his arms, dragging him back. He shouted something lost beneath the roar, his voice drowned irrelevant. Richard sat stiff-face pale, his bourbon hand trembling. He did not stand. He did not clap. He stared as if the ground had crumbled beneath him. My mother, caught between him and me, pressed her hands to her lips, tears spilling as she finally rose, clapping her shoulders, shaking. The applause grew louder, thunder layered on thunder. My blood still dripped warm against my collar, but it no longer felt like shame. It felt like proof. Proof that no glass, no slap, no sneer could erase what I had built. Proof that the vow I made at 25 was being fulfilled in front of 300 witnesses. I lowered my hand, breath steady, and the crowd pressed closer with their applause as though they could lift me higher with sound alone. Hargrove's salute held for a long moment, his eyes steady on mine. Then he lowered it, nodding with the respect Ethan had chased but never earned. I turned to the podium, gripping its edge, the blood on my fingers smearing the polished wood. The MC looked shaken, papers trembling in his hands, but I leaned into the microphone before he could speak. Thank you, I said, my voice carrying through the hall. Thank you for seeing what service means, not just in medals, not just in stars, but in sacrifice. The hall quieted, leaning into every word. I looked out over the sea of faces, over Richard's pale stare, over Ethan's restrained fury. All my life, I said my family called me weak. They told me this uniform was nothing, that my path was a joke. Tonight, you see who I am. I am not invisible. I am not their disappointment. I am Major General Madeline Carter. Applause erupted again, sharper, harder, carrying the weight of vindication. My throat tightened, but my voice did not falter. This uniform is not a game. It is sacrifice service leadership. It is the lives of those who never came home, the families who gave everything. It is the promise that no matter how hard they try to diminish us, we will stand. I stepped back, my vision swimming, the blood still warm, but my spirit blazing. The hall rose once more, cheers rolling like thunder, and in the middle of it Richard slumped back smaller than I had ever seen him. My mother's tears flowed freely, her hands still clapping. Ethan's struggles against security grew weaker, his voice reduced to silence. And above it all, the echo of Hargrove's salute lingered, a seal on the vow I had carried since 25. The ceremony was meant to crown my career. Instead, it became the trial of my family. And for the first time, I stood not just as an officer, but as a daughter who had reclaimed her worth before the world. The applause thundered so loud it rattled the chandeliers above. I stood behind the podium, my hands trembling, my temples stinging where shards of glass had cut. Security dragged Ethan toward the back of the hall, his protests drowned out by the ovation. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his jaw tight, his face pale as if every brick of his empire had been pulled out from under him. My mother clapped through tears, her frail body shaking, her eyes fixed on me as though she were seeing me for the first time. I gripped the podium tighter, blood streaking the polished wood, and felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes pressing down. This was no longer just a ceremony. This was a reckoning. I leaned into the microphone. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Thank you, I said. The applause softened but did not die. People leaned forward, waiting. I swallowed hard, tasting copper, and continued. All my life I have been told what I cannot be. That service is weakness, that this uniform is a costume, that the sky is no place for someone like me. The words carried through the hall, hanging heavy in the silence. My family dismissed me. They called me little pilot fly girl, said I was wasting my life. They laughed at every step, mocked every choice. My eyes locked on Richard. His stare faltered for the first time, his lips pressed into a thin line. And yet, I pressed on. For 26 years, I have carried those words into every mission. I carried them into combat zones. I carried them into strategy briefings at the Pentagon. I carried them every time I put on this uniform. And every single time those words became fuel. The hall murmured whispers rippling, but no one looked away. I drew a breath and let the anger rise. Tonight you saw what those words created. A son of this family raised to believe cruelty was strength hurled a glass at my head in the heart of the Pentagon. He thought it would break me. He thought it would shame me. I straightened, shoulders squared. But here I stand. Blood does not equal weakness. It equals sacrifice. Service is not shame. It is honor. My voice grew stronger, resonating against the marble walls. To every young officer here who has been told you are not enough, to every daughter dismissed by her family, to every son overlooked because you did not fit their mold, hear me. You do not need their permission to shine. The hall erupted again, applause and cheers, rising tears glistening in the eyes of some younger officers in the crowd. A senator near the front wiped his face. A colonel nodded, his jaw clenched. I steadied myself, forcing my gaze back to Richard. You taught me silence. I said, my tone lower, sharper. You taught me humiliation. You thought it would keep me small, but it made me rise higher. You called me weak, but tonight this hall sees who I am. Major General Madeline Carter. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing. Richard's eyes darted to the floor. Ethan's shouts from the back grew faint as he was hauled away, irrelevant in the storm. I leaned forward, my voice breaking but strong. And I am not done. The hall hushed again, 300 people leaning toward me, waiting. I steadied my breath, the sting at my temple, reminding me that pain could either silence or sharpen. I chose sharp. I told them I am not done because leadership is not only about stars on a shoulder. It is about standing even when your legs shake, speaking, even when your voice cracks, owning your path, even when those closest to you try to tear it away. My voice grew steadier with each word, the rhythm finding its own strength. I wanted to thank every airman who had trusted me, every commander who had pushed me, every comrade who had never come home. I wanted the room to know that every scar on me was built from service, not shame. I looked toward the younger officers in the crowd, some barely 30 faces bright with the mix of pride and fear I remembered so well. I said to them, you will be told you are not enough. You will be told you do not belong. But your worth is not decided by those voices. It is forged in how you rise and how you serve and how you refuse to yield. Applause rippled again, not the thunder of before, but something deeper, steadier, as though the hall itself understood. My throat tightened when I turned toward my mother. She sat trembling, her eyes wet, her hands clasped against her chest. For years, she had been silent, pressed down by Richard's shadow, trapped by fear. I locked eyes with her and said, I see you, Mom. I know the silence you carried. I know the fear. And I want you to know that tonight you do not have to be silent anymore. Her shoulders shook, and she nodded, tears spilling freely, a sob breaking loose from years of being contained. The hall seemed to hold its breath with her. I turned back to the microphone. I said my family thought mocking me would erase me. They thought humiliation would make me vanish. But here in the Pentagon, in front of leaders of this nation, I stand not erased, but written in bold. And let this be clear. Cruelty is not strength. Silence is not peace. Control is not love. The words landed heavy. I saw senators nod, generals, straightened staffers wipe their eyes. Richard sat frozen, his face gray, his hands clenched on his knees. I could almost hear the cracking of the image he had built for decades, the empire of control he had imposed on our house. I let the silence linger a moment longer, then finished. Service is not about seeking applause. It is about carrying the weight when others cannot. It is about sacrifice, about resilience, about truth. And for those who have been told by family, by bosses, by anyone that your path is worthless, let my blood tonight remind you, worth is not given, it is earned. The hall erupted once more, applause slamming like a wave, people rising to their feet, some cheering, some clapping through tears. I stepped back from the podium, my vision blurred, my heart racing. In that moment, the pain of years lifted, replaced by something I had never felt in that house in Richmond: freedom, vindication, a new beginning. As I turned, I caught sight of Hargrove again, his eyes steady with respect. He gave me a slight nod, silent but powerful. My mother rose slowly from her seat, her face wet, her hands shaking. She whispered through the roar, "Proud of you, Maddie." Richard remained seated, his empire shattered, his authority exposed. The public fallout was sealed. This was not just a promotion ceremony. It was Judgment Day for the Harpers, and for the first time, I was no longer their little soldier girl. I was Major General Madeline Carter, and the world knew it. The roar of the applause echoed in my ears long after I stepped down from the podium. Security had dragged Ethan out of the hall, his voice breaking into desperate shouts as if he still believed he had some authority here. But the truth was laid bare. His act of violence had not earned him respect. It had ended him. Within hours, the official report circulated. Ethan Harper, United States Army captain relieved of duty on the spot, charged with assault at a federal ceremony. By morning, the Military Times splashed the headline: Captain Harper disgraced at Pentagon event. His career was not suspended. It was finished. All the arrogance, all the sneers, all the years of entitlement vanished in the space of a broken glass. Richard Harper's fall was slower, more painful, and far more public. He had built his reputation as a man of order, a corporate titan whose family mirrored his discipline. Now his son was disgraced, his daughter revealed as a national leader, and his silence during the attack caught on dozens of phones. Footage spread across social media before the night ended. In every video, Richard sat motionless as the glass flew toward me as though condoning it. By dawn, journalists demanded statements. The Washington Post ran a story. Richard Harper, Apex Construction CEO, silent as stepson, attacks Major General at Pentagon. Investors pulled back. Partners hesitated. The empire he built on fear and image cracked. He was no longer the admired patriarch. He was the man who looked away when his daughter bled. For me, the world shifted in a way I had never imagined. I had spent years hiding my stars from my family, shrinking my victories so they would not use them as weapons. Now there was no hiding. Overnight, my name filled headlines. The youngest Major General in Air Force history survives attack at her own promotion. Major General Carter delivers fiery speech on resilience and family betrayal. I woke to find messages flooding my phone. Fellow officers, senators, even strangers. Some wrote of admiration. Others told me my words had reached them in ways I could not fathom. One young lieutenant messaged me saying her own father had dismissed her career as a waste. After watching me, she promised she would never again hide her ambition. The recognition felt heavy, but it was a burden I welcomed. For once, the weight I carried was not silence. It was truth. The next week, the Pentagon released a statement praising my leadership and condemning the violence. The Joint Chiefs personally called me to reaffirm their trust. Invitations poured in, panels on leadership, interviews on national television. I accepted few, but each time I spoke, I thought of the girl I had been at 17, packing my bags in Richmond while Richard's face burned red with fury. She had been told she was wasting her life. Now she was being asked to shape the nation's defense. At home, the fractures grew wider. Margaret called me through tears, apologizing for years of silence, telling me she wished she had spoken sooner. I told her gently it was never too late. Richard remained silent. When reporters cornered him outside Apex headquarters, he muttered no comment, his once booming voice reduced to a whisper. Ethan was barred from base housing, stripped of his clearance, his name whispered with disgust among his peers. And me, the daughter who was supposed to be a family embarrassment, was now the face of strength splashed across every outlet from Washington to Los Angeles. Walking through the corridors of the Pentagon days later, officers stopped me with salutes sharper than before, their respect no longer just for my rank, but for the story that now followed me. A staffer whispered as I passed, "She is the one who stood bleeding and did not back down." That was the legacy sealed that night. Not just a star pinned to my shoulder, but a truth carved into every witness. My family's attempt to crush me had only built me higher. 3 months later, the sting of glass at my temple had healed into a faint scar, barely visible beneath my hairline, but the memory lived in every step I took through the Pentagon's marble corridors. That morning, I walked with measured pace, the air sharp with the scent of polished floors and faint coffee drifting from staff offices. At my side, not trailing with the confidence of a titan, but moving with the hesitant shuffle of a man unsteady, was Richard Harper. The same man who once declared that no daughter of his would waste her life in uniform now followed me through the most secure building in the nation. His suit was still crisp, his tie straight, but there was something diminished in him. His shoulders curved slightly forward, his gaze darting to the floors, his voice low whenever he spoke. He was not here by choice. He had called my mother weeks earlier, saying he needed to see me, and against every instinct I had built to shield myself, I agreed. Some part of me needed this meeting too. I led him past portraits of generals who had shaped wars and policies, men and women whose strategies were studied around the world. His eyes flicked up at the frames, and I caught the flicker of unease. He had once commanded boardrooms filled with hundreds, but here, the walls told a story he had never been part of. We stopped before the heavy wooden door of my office. The plaque read, "Major General Madeline Carter, Strategic Command." I pushed the door open and stepped aside for him to enter. He paused, reading the name twice, then walked in as though entering a cathedral. The office was spacious, lined with shelves of reports and awards flags positioned perfectly in each corner, a wide desk stacked with briefing notes for the next week's defense review. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a sharp glow across the eagle insignia on my uniform. Richard stood in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw moving slightly as if wrestling with words. I leaned against the edge of my desk, waiting. Finally, he turned his voice unsteady. "2 stars at 44, he said slowly, almost to himself. "The youngest ever. Why did you never tell me?" His question landed heavy, but I did not rush to fill the silence. I let him sit with it, let him feel the weight of years where my silence had been his design. Then I answered, "Because you would never have listened. You decided when I was 18 that I was wasting my life, and every holiday, every phone call after that, you reminded me. You called me little soldier girl, you compared me to Ethan, you made sure I knew my choice was a disappointment." He flinched, his eyes dropping to the carpet. "I wanted you to see me," I continued. "Not the stars, not the rank, but me. So I kept my promotions quiet. I thought maybe someday you would ask who I had become without needing proof. But you never did." His throat worked, his hands tightening. "I thought you were running," he said finally. "I thought you were hiding from real responsibility. Boardrooms, contracts, deals, those were the battles I knew. I thought if I could push you toward them, I was protecting you." He sank into the chair across from my desk, his voice low. "I was wrong. All these years, I was wrong." He looked up at me, his eyes wet for the first time I could remember. "I am proud of you, Maddie. Not because of the stars, but because you stood where I would have crumbled. You carried what I could not even imagine." My chest tightened, the words I had waited decades to hear, landing like a blow and a balm at once. I sat across from him, my voice softer. I am not blameless either. I let pride keep me silent. I let my anger fuel walls instead of bridges. But tonight, you see the office I built, the battles I fought, and you see that my path was never a detour. It was my calling. He nodded slowly, his breath shaky, and whispered, "Then let me say what I never did. I am sorry." The room held the words between us like something sacred. For the first time in my life, Richard Harper did not tower above me. He sat small, human, broken open. And I, the daughter who was supposed to be silent, finally felt seen. When Richard left my office that afternoon, I stayed seated at my desk long after the echo of his footsteps disappeared down the Pentagon corridor. The sunlight had shifted, streaking across the polished surface, touching the scattered reports and the framed photo of my squadron on deployment years earlier. I sat there thinking about the girl I once was at 17, clutching the enlistment papers with trembling hands, hearing my stepfather's voice in my ears calling me a fool. That girl had stood at a crossroads between silence and defiance, and she chose defiance, not knowing it would carve scars across decades of her life. For years, I believed I was fighting only for myself, clawing for dignity in a family that treated me like a shadow. But the truth was larger. Every battle, every insult, every scar was shaping me to stand not only for myself, but for others who had been silenced by their own families, bosses, or communities. That realization struck as hard as any blow I had taken in uniform. I thought of Ethan once Richard's golden son dragged out of the Pentagon in disgrace. His downfall was the final proof that cruelty was not power, that entitlement built only hollow strength. His career lay in ruins, but I did not rejoice. His collapse was the natural outcome of years of praise for arrogance, years of enabling violence. I thought of Margaret, my mother, her tears that night washing away years of silence. I thought of the officers who had written me after my speech, telling me that my words carried them through their own storms. And I thought of the younger woman who had whispered as I passed, saying she finally believed she could stay in the service because of me. That was when I understood the larger truth. The lesson is simple, but it is heavy. You cannot wait for permission to shine. I spent years hiding my stars, folding my victories into silence, hoping one day Richard might look at me with pride without needing proof. I thought if I earned enough in secret, he would someday ask about me without sneer or scorn. That day never came. It came only when the world forced it into the open. And I realized I had wasted years waiting for recognition that was never his to give. Recognition belongs to you, to the work you put in, to the sacrifices you make, to the scars you carry with honor. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of my uniform, the stars on my shoulders gleaming in the late light. These were not decorations. They were reminders of battles fought and lessons earned. Each star told a story of defiance, of persistence, of nights in war zones and mornings in briefing rooms where doubt whispered louder than any enemy, and each star told the story of surviving not only the battlefield, but the battlefield of family. That is a war many of you know all too well. If your family has ever told you that your path is worthless, I want you to hear me now. Their blindness does not define your vision. If a parent has called you weak, if a sibling has mocked your dream, if you have been pushed aside at the dinner table so someone else could shine, you are not invisible. You are building your strength in silence, and one day when the light finally turns on you, the truth will be undeniable. But do not make my mistake. Do not bury your victories waiting for permission. Speak them, share them, claim them, not to rub them in the face of those who doubted you, but to honor yourself and those who may need your courage as proof they are not alone. That is the real reason I stood bleeding at that podium and chose to speak. Not to crush Richard, though his silence was shattered that night. Not to destroy Ethan, though his violence destroyed him. I spoke because I knew in that hall there were people who had heard the same words I grew up with. You are not enough. You are wasting your life. You will never matter. And I needed them to hear that those words do not hold power. What holds power is how you rise after hearing them. In the weeks since that night, I have been stopped on bases and airports, even on the streets of Washington. People thank me not for my rank, but for my words. A woman in her 60s told me her father never once told her he was proud, but after watching my speech, she called her own daughter and said it aloud for the first time. A young cadet told me he was ready to quit because his family laughed at his dream. After my speech, he stayed. That is the ripple of truth when it is spoken aloud. It does not end with you. It moves outward, freeing others. So here is the lesson I leave you with. Do not wait for applause. Do not wait for the nod of someone who may never give it. Do not wait for family to understand choices they are unwilling to see. Your worth is not their currency to spend. Your worth is your own. You are the general of your life. You command it. You protect it. You defend it. And sometimes you fight battles in silence until the day comes when the silence is broken in a single moment of truth. That moment will hurt, but it will also heal. As I close, I want to speak directly to you watching this. Has your family ever torn you down, ever made you believe you were small? If so, You know the ache I carried, but you also know the fire that can come from it. Do not let that fire burn you away. Let it forge you. Stand tall. Claim your path. Speak your truth even if your voice shakes, because one day, someone else will need your story as proof they can survive theirs. If this story has touched you, if you have ever lived in the shadow of a family's dismissal or cruelty, I invite you to share it in the comments. Your words may be the rope someone else needs to climb out of their silence. And if you want more stories that expose the hidden battles inside families and reveal the strength it takes to win, subscribe. Stay with me, because together we are not invisible, we are unshakable.